Greetings and welcome to our summer bonus episodes of the Food Professor Podcast presented by Cattle.
Once again, Sylvain and I are taking a couple of the summer months off to recharge and get ready for our next season. So as the official podcast for the SIAL Food Innovation Show this year in Toronto and spending some time at the Ontario Craft Wineries Conference in Niagara Falls, Sylvain and I had the opportunity to interview some of the leading thought leaders, brands, and makers in the food industry. As the saying goes, these are their stories.
Stay tuned for Season 6 of the Food Professor Podcast, debuting August 28th. We'll be back on the mic together live with our particular brand of truth, insight, interviews, custom research from our friends at Cattle, and yes, a whole lot of fun.
Well, we have a special guest today. I can't believe we have not had him on before. We've been doing this for 5 years.
How does this happen?
I don't know. I have no idea. I've seen.
We turn our minds now to agriculture.
Exactly. But the guy, the person, Keith Currie, president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Welcome to the Food Professor Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. And yeah, I should have been here sooner, but here we are now.
Well, yeah, and it's better face to face, to be honest, because most of our interviews are remote. We talk to people from all over the world, but it's much better when we actually see each other. Here at SIAL, you've been to SIAL before?
I have, yeah. I have been, yeah.
And so what do you think of the show so far?
Well, it's a great show, and you know, I've had some conversations with a number of different people here, and especially with the folks at FCC, reminding them that
Farm Credit Canada for the listeners.
Farm Credit Canada, sorry, yes. And I don't think a lot of the membership that I represent, and by the way, I'm representing 190,000 farmers and ranchers from coast to coast to coast here in Canada, as an 8th generation farmer myself. And I don't think our producers understand the connection between the beyond the farm gate processing, manufacturing, retail side, and how integral and important it is to what we do on the farm. Their health contributes to our health and vice versa. And so building those relationships with the partners beyond the farm gate, well, may seemingly be daunting for a farm organization to do and might be hard to show return. There really is that long-term benefit of those relationships when you can collectively go forward to deal with governments domestically or governments internationally or even subnationally and how we promote and make agriculture better overall.
How many of your members are aware that SIAL actually exists?
My guess is likely not many.
Yeah.
Probably some of the large operations that might do some direct marketing. Maybe familiar.
Actually, you're right, because I've seen some farmers actually right there at the Canadian kiosks. Every other year, you'll find a farmer selling directly to consumers or trying to find a market for the product.
Well, you look at, there's a lot of booths here, not just from Canada. Well, Ontario has a booth here. The Dairy Farmers of Canada have a booth. A big sponsorship area where there's a lot of different dairy products. But if you look at other countries that are here, what are they promoting? Well, they're promoting food. They're food products, and they have food samples. So, you know, when you walk into your house and you look at just about any house on the planet, what's right in the middle of the house? It's a kitchen. It's a kitchen, right? It's a gathering point. It's a social part of our lives. It's obviously important to living because we need to eat to survive, but it's such an integral part of our existence that we just take for granted, you know. And so I think there's tremendous opportunity for agriculture from an economic standpoint, from a food security standpoint, obviously, and certainly an environmental standpoint that I don't think always gets understood. And as much as everyone here is about the business of food and how we promote food, those other two things, or other three things, those other three pillars are all built within what they're doing here at this conference. And so how do we connect the entire value chain to promote that going forward? And that's where this conference is great at pulling everybody together.
So 8th generation farmer, tell us about yourself. Where'd you grow up?
So I grew up on the home farm, obviously, as being an 8th generation farmer. It's Collingwood, Ontario. For those of you not familiar with Ontario, it's about 2 hours straight north of Toronto. It used to be an hour and a half, but the traffic's got worse, so now it's 2 hours.
There's some good skiing there.
There's some great skiing there. Blue Mountain is an inner west facility. It's not quite the same as Western Canada or in Quebec, but it's
somewhat smaller mountain.
It's somewhat smaller bump, yeah. But it's a 5-minute drive for me, so it's fantastic. When I am home, I can zip over for a couple hours and ski and then go home again. And it's a great part of the world to live in. Wasaga Beach is a community that's close by. It's the world's largest freshwater beach. It's 14 kilometers.
I didn't know that.
Have you ever been
sandy
there?
beach.
I'm not a beach guy, but I know Wasaga Beach.
I used to be, when I was younger, I was an officer in the military. I was stationed at Borden.
At Borden, sure.
And went to Wasaga Beach. I was a Quebecer. I had no idea it existed. And when I went there for the first time, I was just, wow.
Yeah. On the weekends, there's 100,000 people. And during the rest of the time, there's about 20,000. So it explodes. But it's a tremendous tourist area, which is good and bad. It's not the same area that I grew up in, but I think everyone on the planet can probably say that. We change, right? There's been
speaking of change, how did you go from being a 8th-generation farmer to being one of the most respected advocates or lobbyists? What do you call yourself?
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. So I'm a farmer who lobbies on behalf of other farmers. Our organization is there to primarily work on Parliament Hill in Ottawa to make things better for the agriculture industry in Canada, and more specifically for the membership, our farmers and ranchers who, I shocked a room today, mostly manufacturing people, by saying that, our government has been focused since all this stuff's going on south of the border on primarily the automobile sector, the steel and aluminum industry, forestry, oil and gas. But if you take those 4 sectors and add up the gross domestic product annually of those 4 sectors, it's about $130 billion a year, which is pretty significant.
Wow.
And they employ about 750 to 800,000 people.
That's a lot of people.
That's combined.
Wow.
But agriculture is $150 billion annually GDP, and we employ upwards of 2.5 million. So 3 times the employment and 20 billion more than the other 4 combined. Yet,
why doesn't ag get the respect it deserves?
Well, I think agriculture is just a quiet success story all the time. Yes, we have sectors that go through struggles from time to time, but the industry as a whole just continues to do well. We have resilient farmers that are facing Mother Nature. That's our biggest challenge, both positively and negatively, that we're dealing with on a daily basis. We've adapted technology like no other industry has in order to not only combat Mother Nature, but also to advance our operations from a production, from a sustainability aspect, from an economic aspect. And quite often governments don't look at those 3 pillars, which are important. The social one around food security is obviously on everybody's top of mind right now. I know they talk a lot about food prices, but we're still only spending a little over 10% of our annual income on food. By the second week in February, average Canadian has made enough money to pay for the groceries for the entire year.
Sylvain, how does that compare around the world? If it's 10% in Canada, is that low?
Well, based on our data, we're probably number 5 or 6 in the world in terms of the lowest percentage.
Least amount spent.
Yeah, dedicated to food, absolutely. And I think you're right, Keith. We've marginalized food in our lives a little bit as Canadians, and we're quick to complain about food prices. My job as a scientist is to inform the public the best I can. I think the issue around food inflation was overblown for a while. I mean, cycles do happen. Ukraine was invaded. And I knew what was going to happen.
Sure. I mean, between Ukraine and Russia, that's a third of the world's small grain production.
Exactly.
Right? So all of a sudden...
And a lot of fertilizer.
Well, a lot of fertilizer, yeah. But as far as the grain production, you're also talking about major ports now that are disrupted for exporting that product. So it's going to have an effect. Just like COVID had an effect where processing lines got slowed down, supply chain lines got slowed down. And so what happens when the supply goes down, the price goes up. But all in all, when you look at this industry, it just continues to grow, and I think people take it for granted, much like much like conceptually we've taken for granted our relationship with the U.S. from a trading aspect.
That's an interesting point.
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, as president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, we just completed an election campaign. What are your thoughts on results, and based on this new parliament we have now, what are some of your main concerns as president of the Federation moving forward? What are some of the things that you would want the government to think about for our farmers in Canada?
So I've been pretty consistent during this election campaign when people have asked, what am I looking for as an outcome of the election? And my standard response was, I'm looking for change. And what I meant by that was it could mean a change in who's governing us, what party's governing us. But what I meant by that is whoever forms the next government, I'm looking for the change of attitude towards agriculture. And looking at agriculture, and I don't mean that as woe is me, you guys never think about us. I mean it more change in the perspective of how they look at agriculture from an opportunity aspect. The opportunities that we have to continue to grow. My background in farm politics was I spent 20 years around the Ontario Federation Board of Directors table.
You were president.
I was president for 4 years.
For 4 years,
of OFA as well, and just in Ontario alone, we're a day's drive. We have 250 million people within a day's drive of Ontario, which is why the food manufacturing sector in Ontario is so big. But it can be bigger. And we have so many more opportunities in agriculture right across this country to really make that explode. And
it feels, we've made this point on the podcast before, that they can't take, while they may move and they may convince some big automakers to move their plants, agriculture will and always will be with us. So it seems like the perfect thing for us to focus on.
Well, we're blessed in this country with tremendous soil, tremendous natural capital assets, really. Soil and climate.
Yeah.
And with our changing climates, and climate change conversation's a whole different conversation for another day, but our climate has changed. And to a certain extent here, for those of us in Canada, it's allowed us to change our cropping, changing the type of crops we grow or the length of days we have to grow, so we can actually produce more. It comes with other challenges, of course, but we're taking advantage.
Pests, for example.
Or pests, for example. So when I talked about technology right off the top, when I say the word technology, you think hardware. Like, I'm looking at this microphone in front of me and how much it's changed over the last 100 years. It's got better. But we also have livestock genetics as a technology. We have seed genetics as technology. We have crop protection products, the technology within that. Technology in general right across the board has been phenomenal in agriculture. And that's allowed us to really deal with whatever kind of weather is changing in our lives, year over year, and that's where our farmers have become resilient and smart both at the same time, and how they deal with it, how they plan for the next year and year beyond, how we continue to peek over our neighbor's fence to see what they're doing so we can steal from them and adapt to what we're doing, and I just think I just keep going back to the opportunities that we have.
This week's episode is sponsored by Cattle, now celebrating 10 years as Canada's voice of the consumer. Cattle empowers Canada's top brands and retailers with unparalleled access to first-party panel data and receipt-based insights. Cattle offers unmatched speed and scale with a budget that doesn't break the bank. They deliver the insights businesses need to outsmart the market and their competition. To learn more, visit cattle.ca or reach out to insights@cattle and mention the Food Professor in order to get your free rapid response survey. That's cattle.ca, CADDLE.ca.
Really, we have to have our government, going back to your question right off the top, or that you asked about what are we looking for. We need to make sure that we're competitive. When we see the Trump administration already given $40 an acre for the 2024 crop, and probably a big package coming out based on what's going on with tariffs, etc., that already puts us at a competitive disadvantage.
And they gotta cover off the $2 billion they're not buying from farmers for USAID, right? There is a lot, and I was reading even now they're closing other social programs, all of which was purchased from American farmers at at the rack rate, right?
Yeah.
That's going away.
But beyond what the U.S. is doing, our government needs to look at a regulatory framework. I always tell people that I look at regulations as like ditches, right? They're that guideline of where to stay on the road. They can't be too big, they can't be too small, they got to be just right. And
where would you start?
Well,
we're talking about the Grains Act. I mean, it's something that was not on any party's platform.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's important, and especially to Western Canada, it's important to our grain growers out there. So there's something that it's been on the table for how long now? Like 10 years? 10, 12 years? Let's just get it done, right? But it is it the priority for day one? Maybe not, but let's not.
So what would be the priority, you think?
Well, I think we need to kind of lump things into kind of three packages. I talked about competitiveness, and that could be dealing with a regulatory framework, as I mentioned, and you said, how does that look like? I'll conceptually use what Premier Ford's done here in Ontario with his red tape reduction. He's not going to throw out a regulation just because I don't like it. It's got to be something that's already duplicated. It doesn't make any sense. And he's reduced regulations a lot here in Ontario that's just made a lot of sense. So that concept of let's examine what's on the books and let's get rid of the stuff that doesn't make sense. I mean, there was an example of some regulations back at the last part of Kathleen Wynn's tenure here in Ontario where there was 3 different acts that it didn't matter what we did as farmers, we were doing it illegal, right? Because nobody looked at the different acts that were already in place, and they added more acts to try and solve some other problem. And you can't just solve problems with a regulation. So I think if you take a look at red tape reduction, that's part of the competitiveness aspect. We really need to build in resiliency. So some of that's environmental, obviously. We're going to have these weather patterns coming and going. So let's look at the big picture long term and how do we do more preventative measures, because that's a lot cheaper than the cleanup aspect of paying for cleanup, So how do we look at it long term? And the struggle with that, because it's not easy, is because you go across the country and there's so many different microclimates, so many different regional areas that are affected by different types of weather patterns. So you really have to talk to the people on the ground and design a program for those regions that are going to work for them. But that's building into our resiliency, and resiliency is also about the right trade deals and making countries honor their trade deals, challenging countries that are putting in non-tariff trade barriers that are just silly. And that's part of the third pillar is that rules-based trade that we need to have. We're a trading nation. There's no way of getting out of that. If we want to grow, we still have to expand our trade. That could be new markets. It could be expanding our existing markets, whatever that looks like.
We've talked about a couple themes we've had lately. One is interprovincial barriers coming down, so we trade with ourselves. And the second is, how do we get after the India opportunity?
India's an interesting animal, so to speak, because I do sit on I'm a director on the World Farm Organization Board of Directors too, and I always am fascinated by the fact that India is considered a developing nation. I haven't quite figured out how they managed to pull that one off at this point in time, but they are, and they don't always play by the rules. So I think we have to look to partners where there are opportunities, but we have to look to partners where there's opportunities that we can actually use. And certainly India's an opportunity for, certainly our lentils and our chickpeas growers for sure.
Canola oil, I think they're big consumer.
I was going to say canola and even small grains. But we got to have access to the markets without them throwing some kind of a non-tariff barrier in there, and that's always the challenge. And so how do we do that? Well, let's continue to grow with those trusted partners that honor their trade agreements, and then look to our government to make sure they are enforcing adequately the trade deals that we have with other countries, because we don't seem to stop anybody from sending stuff into our country through a trade deal. And so let's figure out a way that we can do that, so that we can still continue to have access to these markets, and really base it on science. Don't base it on geopolitics.
2 questions for you. One about carbon pricing. I know a lot farming communities are concerned about the carbon pricing policy
Now we have a government in place favorable to the industrial carbon tax, even looking at border carbon taxes. What are your thoughts? Like, is the farming community concerned, or are concerns gone now because the consumer carbon tax is gone, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the carbon tax isn't gone. It's just at 0%. Right, so it's
the consumer one,
the retailable, it's at 0% with the ability to bump it up at any time quite easily. So to say it's gone, that's a wait and see for me. Although I'll take Prime Minister Carney's word that it's going to stay there. If we have to have a price on carbon, and I think we're foolish if we as Canadians don't recognize that that's where the world's going. We need to look at a cap and trade type of pricing system, because that's where the industrial pricing comes in. What I'm a little confused about is there's a big push for carbon credits, obviously, and that's something that certainly farmers can participate in, although it's never going to lift a mortgage for anybody on the farm. But, if you're involved in a cooperative or in an aggregation type of system where you might receive a little bit of money, spending money for the weekend, that's fine. But at the end of the day, what that's not doing is it's not making our emitters be better. Mm-hmm. It's rewarding them by allowing them to, instead of spending the money on changing their emissions, they're just buying credits to put it off. But I think the biggest challenge we had with the carbon tax is the way it was introduced. And for those of us in agriculture, the concept of let's change habits by putting in a carbon tax.
Because the pushback was pretty aggressive.
It was. Yeah. And that's fine, except that, nobody talked to us from the government to understand that we don't have options to change to. We don't have three-phase power in rural Canada, and our hydro system, our infrastructure is so old, we require a complete infrastructure rebuilding. So we don't have three-phase power to go to electrical. We don't have, in a lot of places in rural Canada, we don't have access to natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel, but it's a much cleaner fossil fuel. Yeah. It can be an interstep. Like I've said for years, when it comes to driving vehicles, why aren't we looking at hydrogen as an intermediate step to electric vehicles? Right?
Makes sense.
Like, why don't we look at that? Well, it's like cutting off our nose to spite our face. And so agriculture just didn't have a lot of options. We're a generation away from commercially having electric-powered, self-propelled vehicles on the farm. It's not there yet. And when it's spring seeding time, I don't want to park the tractor for 12 hours to recharge, right? Or the combine to recharge, or whatever.
And you need power.
And we need power.
Yeah.
And nobody's talking about the fact, I know technology is going to change as we go forward, but nobody's talking about the fact we're ripping out 4,000 pounds of the Earth's material to make a car battery, every car battery, and we're shipping it all over the world to put it together. What's that look like from a carbon footprint? But getting back to the point about carbon pricing, the rest of the world's going there, and we're probably less than a decade away from having border carbon adjustments as part of our trade deals. So we can't bury our heads in the sand around carbon pricing. We have to look at how we do it effectively so that it accomplishes the goals you want to achieve without burying the people who you're pulling the carbon pricing from. And that simply, let's start with a conversation. I go into every meeting with governments. It doesn't matter what the issue is, and I say, okay, what's your goal? You want to go at this door, I want to go at that door, but we both want to go at the doors together. So how do we figure out how we get there together? That's going to make the most sense for both of us. And those kind of conversations sound simplistic. It's not that easy, but it's easier if you at least try.
Or listen.
Yeah. I mean, I know we get...
Because I was shocked when our lab was approached by a group asking us to evaluate the impact of the carbon tax on food affordability in Canada, and I was shocked when I was told that the government never bothered to look into it from farm gate to plate.
Farm to fork, yeah.
There was no evaluation until 2 years ago when we started, and we published our studies now.
Well, obviously the biggest impact on climate emissions in particular is transportation, which will also have the biggest impact on food price from a carbon pricing standpoint. It takes fuel to drive those trucks, and the trucking fleets don't have right now the capacity to go electric. They don't have the trucks available. They don't have the range available. My local Ford dealer, I walked in just out of curiosity to get a price on a Ford Lightning truck, and he says, "I'm not going to sell you one." I said, "Well, why not?" He says, "If you want to go down the next dealer down the road and buy one, knock yourself out." He says, "I'm not going to sell you one." I said, "Well, why?" He says, "Because you'll hate me." He says, "You'll get 100 kilometers when you're pulling a gravity wagon or a hay wagon or whatever you're pulling, and then you got to recharge." He says, "You're going to hate me." He says, "Until they get the technology better in the batteries and get more range," he says, "I'm not going to sell you a truck."
Right.
Right. Now, most dealers
that's an honest.
Well, he wants me back, right?
Exactly.
Most dealers aren't like that. They're going to sell you whatever they want. But that's
well, at least once anyway.
Or at least once, yeah. But
not
so that's what
time.
we're looking at from a fleet perspective on EVs, which is why the carbon pricing was so impactful to farmers because we just didn't have an alternative, right?
One last question: next gen. That's a big issue in farming. What's the work that you guys are doing in terms of encouraging the next generation of farmers coming down the pipe?
Well, it's interesting, and I have a bunch of different responses to that question. And there's nothing easy about it. 98% of our farms are still family-owned and operated. So that means there's family members coming up through. And when I first started down the road of my agriculture career, the average age of the farmer was like 56, 57, and everybody's freaking out like what's going to happen. I think it's a little different, obviously, now because we have the boomers that are going to be retiring. So that's a much bigger number of people, bigger chunk for sure. So that's certainly different. But we certainly are trying to get our youth more engaged in what we're doing from the political side of things and getting them engaged in things, but also on how they can talk to their parents and their grandparents. And honestly, I think when we look at the average age of the farmer, what is skewed a little bit about that is we have multiple generations on the farm with different ownership aspects of the farm. So grandpa and grandma might still own the property. Mom and dad, or son or daughter might own some of the assets, and then sons or nieces and nephews and daughters might own or manage part of own some of the other infrastructure, right? So you have different aspects, different generations of ownership that might skew that age a little bit. But the reality is the boomers are retiring. But I think through helping with succession planning, there's so many more tools that are available now than when I started. There was virtually nothing when I started. Where it would turn to get some advice on how I talked to my parents about taking over the farm, because when you're 50 years old, you're going to live for another 40, maybe potentially, and you want people want you to get out of the way and let them farm. It's not that simple. But I think we've got a lot smarter on how we are managing and giving up managing aspect to make sure that our youth are feeling more engaged with the farm. And now how do we take those multi-million-dollar businesses? That's really the crux of the issue is the amount of wealth that's accumulated in the assets on the farm now is huge. So how do we transfer that where it doesn't kill the next generation coming in from a financing standpoint, but still gives the parents the opportunity to return the investment that they put into the business, and do it so that nobody gets nailed from a tax perspective. We can smoothly transfer that over, and I think we have a lot more tools. We have our financial institutes that are working on different tools, and certainly again talking to the government about those transition pieces to make sure that it's another way to guarantee that we continue to drive the opportunity in agriculture by having the right tax structure that doesn't penalize the next generation coming on.
Yeah, and there's so many moving parts. It's such a great discussion. Yeah. Because being fairly new to ag, I've been doing this for a bunch of years. Every time I have a discussion like this, I learn something more. So thanks for joining us on the Food Professor podcast, Keith. It was
I enjoyed
real
it.
Treat.
Thanks for inviting me.
It was about time.
It
was about time.
Long overdue, but you made up for lost time, so to speak. So thanks again for joining us.
All right.
Great stuff.
Appreciate it.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into our summer bonus interview series. Michael and I will be back live on the microphone together in late August. I'm Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, the Food Professor. Take care.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc. Safe summer travels, everyone. See you in the fall.